What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Tomatoito Boxing Show. And let's jump into this past weekend's fights. One of them that we want to jump into, I guess we'll cut this up into several different episodes so we could actually do justice by the fights that took place and breaking down their respective divisions as to how these main events shook up the rankings or affected their respective careers. As to what they're trying to accomplish and these fighters that are trying to climb up. So we'll break these down. Let's jump into the big upset that took place this past weekend, and that happened out in Tijuana, Mexico. Jaime Munguia knocked out by Bruno Surace, a French fighter with an undefeated record who had, I believe, going into this fight, 4 knockouts to his credit. There was no need for this fight. A lot of people didn't even know Jaime Munguia was fighting this past Saturday night. Of course, those that are keeping tabs with the division, with boxing, those that are so tuned into Saturday night boxing, hardcore boxing fans were aware that Jaime Munguia had a fight. Top Rank started promoting it. And many asked themselves, why? Who's this fighter that he's challenging against? Who people wanted to know about Bruno Surace. The lead up to the fight, he's relatively unknown, fairly unknown, ignored by the media in the lead up, ignored by the media during the weigh-ins, during the press conferences. Everything was surrounded about Jaime Munguia and his future plans. Leading into this fight, Jaime Munguia had 1 defeat on his record. His otherwise unblemished record, had a hell of a year, kicked off the year out in Phoenix, Arizona against John Ryder. And that performance under the tutelage of Freddie Roach, that performance and the crowd that he was able to attract in Arizona, and the performance that he put together in what was a stoppage victory for him over John Ryder, which resulted in John Ryder calling it a day, calling it a career, in the days following after that fight. That performance for Jaime Munguia meant a lot. It meant the world for him, for his career. It skyrocketed him straight into the big Cinco de Mayo showdown against Canelo Alvarez. The fight that he was clamoring for, that he was asking for years. He wanted Gennady. He wanted Canelo. He finally got Canelo. A big Mexican showdown with a lot of hype. It attracted the fans. It attracted attention of the boxing world and the casuals, because it was a perfect setting for a perfect weekend that is notorious for being a heavily favored Mexican festive weekend out in Las Vegas, Nevada. And a Jaime Munguia performance against a Canelo Alvarez, which showed that he's almost there, but he's not quite there yet. At 41 fights with an unblemished record, he was still levels behind Canelo Alvarez. It also showed the masterful performance and the masterful, or the level that Canelo Alvarez is fighting at as he's coming towards the back end of his career. But Canelo has developed himself into a well-rounded elite level fighter. And it takes a special fighter to be able to defeat him and to contend with him. The fact that he is getting older, he is slowing down a little bit, he is fairly undersized for that division and has been, and has managed to dominate it for as long as he has, says a lot about Canelo Alvarez and where he's performing at. And for Jaime Munguia to be able to go all the way, where the claims came out after the fight that Canelo carried him, that Canelo could have knocked him out, but decided not to because it was his fellow countrymen and this and that. We actually did a whole episode on it where I didn't feel that way. Because I still saw Jaime Munguia pushing forward and hitting Canelo and trying to go inflict damage on Canelo all the way through to the end and doing his best at fighting, taking the fight to Canelo, but it was just not enough. And he's just a level behind that elite level. Great fighter, Jaime Munguia. So that got him the first loss of his career against a great Saul Canelo Alvarez. And that's a hell of a resume still, to have your sole defeat, your lone defeat at the hands of the man who's atop the division. Same for Canelo. A loss against Mayweather up until the point where he suffers a defeat at the hands of Dimitri Bivol. Two great fighters that have victories over him. Legendary fighter in Mayweather. Hall of Famer. And I'm sure Dimitri Bivol will be a Hall of Famer himself. We moved to Jaime Munguia going 1-1 in the first half of the year to September, where he fights Bazinian. A fight that I managed to get an interview with Jaime Munguia. If you want to go check that out on the YouTube channel. I tried to get one with Bazinian, but he was quick to get out of there in the final press conference. A fight that we saw Jaime Munguia tested, frustrated, not looking like himself, not looking like the action fighter that he tends to be. A Bazinian that stayed very composed, who fought behind his jab, and was very uniform in the manner in which he fought Jaime Munguia. Kept him at bay, controlled the distance, all because of his jab. And when Jaime would try to oblige and infiltrate, Bazinian would drop some combinations and find success. And Munguia, again, would drop his hands. Left hand, fairly low, Canelo drops him in the fourth. Left hand, fairly low, gets hurt against Bazinian, keeps him at bay. Frustrated, Jaime Munguia. The story of the night was that Jaime Munguia could not find a way on how to beat Bazinian. Eric Bazinian stayed very composed, very calm, and just boxed. And what we got in the end was that Jaime Munguia just basically went balls to the wall, as they say, and was going to go in and muddy it up and unleash his firepower on Bazinian. That was the gambit that night, and it worked out for him. He got on the inside of Bazinian, got past the jab, eliminated the distance advantage of Bazinian, started exchanging power, and he was a heavier puncher on that night. Heavier puncher than Bazinian, ends up hurting him multiple times until he pulls off an exciting victory for himself. And Jaime Munguia, again, had his hand raised in victory. That should have been it for this year. Jaime Munguia should have put an end to 2024 and moved forward to a 2025 fighting one of the Canadian fighters for Tiger Promotions in Bazinian with the looming Christian Mbili fight. A Christian Mbili who was battle-tested, who did not look as great and as untouchable as he had in the past against a Sergey Derevyanchenko. A Derevyanchenko who is an older fighter, a tough fighter to look good against, a very tactically sound fighter in Derevyanchenko, who happened to injure his bicep against Christian Mbili and fought with one hand and took Mbili all the way to a decision, and a close decision at that, in front of Mbili's home crowd. A Derevyanchenko with two hands healed up. Derevyanchenko will undoubtedly beat Mbili if that rematch ever happens, even at this stage in his career. With one arm, he was piecing up Mbili on numerous rounds where Mbili just relies on his firepower, on his punching power. And that's the attractiveness of an Mbili-Munguia showdown. Because Derevyanchenko himself also gave problems to Munguia and nearly beat Munguia. Many people thought that he beat Jaime Munguia when they faced off against one another. And if you recall, it was a knockdown, a late knockdown that Jaime Munguia managed to pull off against Derevyanchenko that got him that 1 or 2 points on the judges' scorecards and kept them undefeated, handing a defeat to Derevyanchenko. He gives headaches to everybody. He gave headaches to Golovkin, Derevyanchenko did. So this is a Munguia who's had defensive problems, who's had problems keeping his hands up, keeping his guard up. And it's been tested and exposed, and he's been dropped. But his firepower continues to bail him out, and that's the attractiveness of Jaime Munguia. That's why we tune in to watch him. And the fact that he's so confident and has so much confidence in that firepower in his power shots has become dangerous for him now. This should have been it against Eric Bazinian for 2024. Yet they wanted to do this big homecoming, and it's almost as if they're ignoring everything that has happened, not just this year, but in the history of boxing. Those homecomings are horrible for a lot of fighters. We saw it this year. I could give you an example of Subriel Matias, which is the immediate one that pops in my head. Subriel Matias in front of his Puerto Rican home crowd, looking to defend his IBF title against lesser-known Australian fighter in Liam Perro. And what happens? Liam Perro pulls off the upset, and Subriel Matias looks horrible. We could look at November. Boots against Karen Chukasian, a rematch from their January 23 fight, which Boots looked really good in that first fight. Chukasian made the necessary adjustments and was giving headaches and connecting at will on Boots. Boots ends up pulling off the victory, but this nearly went south for him in front of his Philly crowd. He nearly lost his title. And this boogeyman status that Boots has garnered in the welterweight division. He looked every bit human and every bit unimpressive in this fight against Karen Chukasian. Here we go with Jaime Munguia. We saw it with George Kambosos in Australia, not the first time that it happens to him. He fights in front of his home crowd, defending his titles against Devin Haney. Looks horrible, gets pieced up. Devin Haney lifts the titles. They get the big rematch going. That's back in 22. Devin Haney retains his titles and stops George Kambosos in his tracks in front of his home crowd. Earlier this year, George Kambosos has a chance to regain one of his titles, the IBF title, against Vasily Lomachenko. And Lomachenko pieces him up in front of his crowd and stops him. Those homecomings are horrible. Takuma Inoue just lost his title against his fellow countrymen out in Japan. In front of his brother, a fight that Canelo was also sitting on the second row, ringside. And here we go with Jaime Munguia and a big homecoming. I mean, let's talk about the other one. Keyshawn Davis was successful. He successfully had a homecoming coming out party out in Virginia in November. But what about earlier in the year with Shakur, who wins his fight but lost the crowd? Crowd's walking out in his fight, his final fight with Top Rank. The crowd was walking out from how bored they were in Shakur's fight. Those homecomings are horrible. And there's a long history, and these are just a few fights that come to mind, where it often ends up going against the fighters because of a multitude of things. Fighters that end up doing these homecomings against lesser known fighters, they don't wake up. Berlanga had the same thing happen to him a while back in New York. It happened to Miguel Cotto. Miguel Cotto more so in New York than Puerto Rico, where it's hard for him to get up. I think it was against Saddam Ali. Hard for him to get up, or Delvin Rodriguez, one of those. It's hard for him to get up when these are lesser known fighters that they're competing against. And here we go with a Bruno Surace, 25-0. Looks like a decent opponent on paper, an undefeated fighter with a low knockout ratio, overlooked. Jaime Munguia, we all know him. He's marketable, big homecoming, big soccer stadium, attracted all kinds of crowd, all kinds of media from all over Mexico, from Southern California. All kinds of people were on hand to see this big coming out party for Jaime Munguia, and what was to be a 3-1 record in 2024 ends up as a 2-2. Now his loss to Canelo Alvarez is blemished because that valiant effort that he put against the top name in the boxing world in Canelo Alvarez now brings some truth to those claims, or validity to those claims earlier in the year of Canelo having carried him and having done a favor to Jaime Munguia and not stopping him and knocking him out, when people feel that he could have stopped Jaime Munguia in the first half of the fight after that initial knockdown. Now he just brought validity to that. And now he just muddied and threw a wrench in his own plans. Zam for Boxing, you name it, whoever idea this was, Top Rank, whose ever idea it was. Because remember, Golden Boy said that Jaime Munguia is still part of Golden Boy, still has a working relationship with them, promotional relationship with them, but he was only going over to have Top Rank promote him for the exposure of ESPN. And that's what this was. It was a big coming out party to show that he could attract and sell out a stadium, pack a stadium, increase the marketability of Jaime Munguia. And this was a padded fight against a lesser known fighter in Bruno Surace, who didn't get any credit, who didn't have anybody of note in his resume. And this was supposed to be a knockout victory or an easy victory for Jaime Munguia, and he would go 3-1 in 2024 with the doors fully open to him as to what he wants to do in 2025. Whether he fights Christian Mbili in a big showdown for Top Rank, whether he ends up having that big showdown where Diego Pacheco calls him out. Diego Pacheco actually called him out after that August victory that he had over Sulecki. He was hoping for a December showdown. This should have been Pacheco and Jaime Munguia. But when Munguia was going to fight in September, it seemed very unlikely that either fighter would return. Pacheco's going to be fighting Steve Nelson in February, I believe, or late January, actually, to correct myself. And Nelson trains with Bomac and Terrence and very, very good pedigree boxer himself. That's going to be an interesting fight for Pacheco, where he needs to actually have a solid victory against his undefeated Nelson. And if Nelson beats Pacheco, the upside is for either one, whoever pulls this off. Pacheco's the better known fighter, the more accomplished of the two. But for Nelson, this could skyrocket his career if he gets a victory over Pacheco. For Bruno Surace, decent boxer, good combinations, found the holes in Jaime Munguia, which everybody's been talking about in the past, that he continues to leave his hands down, continues to stop punches with his face. We've talked about it on this podcast numerous times. You could go back and check every Jaime Munguia podcast that I've recorded when I've covered his fights. And he tends to block the punches with his face, with his head, instead of his gloves. We talked about it at the beginning of this year when we were doing the live broadcast on the Munguia rider, that he just gets hit and hit and hit, and it's almost like he doesn't feel it. A tactic that would not work against higher level opposition, whether at that time after January, it was looking like he was going to try to get into a showdown with David Benavidez or maybe Canelo or so forth. Well, and it ended up being Canelo. But now you got a lesser-known fighter who had decent boxing abilities in Bruno Surace, who all he had to do, even though Jaime Munguia drops him in the second round, really nasty knockdown, Surace gets back on his feet, takes the fight to Jaime Munguia, starts slowing the pace down, starts dragging it long enough for him to be able to get his gears back and his legs under him, and continues to pot shot and land combinations on Jaime Munguia because Munguia was flat-footed and slow-moving whenever he would move forward. He lunges forward, Surace would land combinations and connect. Found a lot of success against Jaime Munguia. Everything looked like Jaime Munguia was headed for a knockout victory. We just didn't know how it was going to happen or what round it was going to happen. But then we start seeing a flat-footed Munguia, breathing with his mouth open, very slow to get his punches off, not really communicating with the corner. They're asking him to jab, he's not jabbing. And Bruno Surace has enough boxing abilities to be able to recognize, and of course, he has 25-0 record. Whether they've been nobodies or not, it gives validity to the work that Bruno Surace and his team have put together and the game plan that they had. Everything went sideways when Jaime Munguia knocks him down in the second round. And the claims of he's just going to be a paycheck, he's just there to collect a paycheck, was starting to seem valid. But for Surace and these fighters, it's hard for Jaime Munguia, and in my opinion, same thing with Matias and everybody else, Boots Ennis, to get up for these fights. This is not a Kambosos Lomachenko, where Lomachenko is just way better than Kambosos and beats him in front of his home crowd in Kambosos. Lomachenko is he's just better. But for Boots, for Subriel, for Jaime, and we've seen it in the past, these are tough fights for them to get up for, to wake up for, because they're lesser known fighters. It's very different than when you're fighting a top tier, top level, marketable, known fighter. It's hard to get up, and that's where the scares come. That's where the upsets happen. And it happened again. These are lessons in boxing history that have long resonated in the annals of boxing, and here it is again. It presents itself. And a huge wrench that it throws for Jaime Munguia now. Zamfir immediately announces that they're going to execute the rematch clause and pursue it against Bruno Surace. Some people are already claiming, don't take it. Bruno Surace is going to be an even bigger monster now. Having this victory, having survived the power of Jaime Munguia, outboxed them, this is going to be a nightmare for Jaime Munguia to overcome in the rematch. He wants to right the wrong. This is one that he could right the wrong in because it's not a Canelo Alvarez. You got to climb the ladder back up to get to Canelo Alvarez. And that's what he's been trying to do. Having, with the victory this past Saturday, he would have been that step closer, and then continues to clean out whether he had a fight with Caleb Plant or a Diego Pacheco showdown or the Christian Mbili showdown that Top Rank is shooting for. Either way, and it looks like there was already negotiations with Christian Mbili, so they were already looking past Bruno Surace, which is the biggest mistake, and it just proved right again. So now if they go ahead and pursue this rematch, of course it's going to be a big sellout. It's going to be a big marketable fight because everybody wants to see if Jaime Munguia could right the wrong. But it could backfire immensely, especially with a Bruno Surace who had nothing to lose and who did obviously not show up to collect the paycheck, but wanted to go ahead and pull off the upset. Whatever the corner was telling him, Bruno Surace got himself into the fight. Didn't play it safe, but was very composed in overcoming in what Bruno Surace, and for his career, this was the final boss. And he overcame that in amazing fashion. He gets another knockout, and the biggest name of his resume, he manages to knock out. And he knocks him out cold with a beautiful, beautiful right hand. Right on the button. Jaime Munguia drops Bruno Surace. Surace manages to get back into the fight and come do this. Jaime Munguia does not answer the count. Does not even make it to his feet until later. He managed to survive Canelo's flash knockdown. He managed to survive Derevyanchenko dropping him. He's been dropped before. But he doesn't survive Bruno Surace's punch. It's not that Surace has amazing punching power. It's that he was that accurate and got him right on the button. And you could watch that replay over and over and over, and it was strategically near perfection. Executed to near perfection. Congratulations to Bruno Surace, who represented himself and his team extremely well. And for Jaime Munguia, this is not a spit on the man while he's down or kick dirt on the man while he's down type of episode. This just shouldn't have happened. This shouldn't have happened. But it did. So where does Jaime Munguia go now? He's not able to avenge the Canelo fight. He could have with a couple big fights because he continues to move into the way that his career was going. Without the Surace fight, Bazignan was enough to get him Mbili. That would have been a huge fight, and would he have been victorious in that fight? Which, if it does still happen, and he does come out victorious, he'll be right back where he left off. But the immediate panic is, let's right this wrong with Surace because they want to get back to the top. And maybe Canelo will still be there. Maybe Canelo will be retired by the time they make it to the top. And the big showdown will be against somebody else. Should Pacheco be successful over Nelson, the Pacheco-Munguia fight would be huge in LA. A huge crowd. Pacheco's able to attract a big crowd in LA. And Mbili, it would probably be Munguia going to Canada. Or maybe a New York setting or somewhere in between to where the Canadian fan base will be easy for them to travel to support Mbili. But all signs are pointing to them running it back with Bruno Surace and try to right the wrong. If Jaime Munguia comes out successful, he'll be right back where he left off. If it becomes an amazing fight, then guess what? We may very well have a trilogy that burst out of nothing, out of thin air. And it may end up being an amazing trilogy. But if Jaime Munguia just knocks out and wipes the floor with Bruno Surace in the rematch, he'll be right back where he left off and could go ahead and start his path back to the top or continue his path back to the top. the rest of 2025. This just changed the entire outlook for Jaime Munguia as we approach the end of this calendar year and what was supposed to be a 2025 that would get him back to the top. The idea being the first quarter against a big name, whether it be Mbili, and that's where the negotiations were headed, and then maybe a mid-year Pacheco showdown or Caleb Plant with a September big potential return to the ring against a Canelo Alvarez. That was the outlook. Maybe a big September showdown against an Edgar Berlanga. He's got time, but he's got to do things right. A lot of people immediately jump at get rid of Eric Morales. I feel that Eric Morales fixed him quite a bit. I also feel that this immediate change of Freddie Roach and Eric Morales in the last 3-4 fights that he's had has to be causing some type of effect for him. There's a big difference in approach and boxistically, the boxistic approach of each of these trainers. Remember, Freddie Roach trained Manny Pacquiao. Freddie Roach dissected the style of Eric Morales when Freddie cornered Manny Pacquiao against Eric Morales. Complete different styles. And Eric Morales wanting to get Munguia to fight in his style is going to be near opposite because Munguia doesn't have the footwork. He's an action fighter, but he's a power fighter. He has the power punch, the knockout power. He's not elusive like Eric Morales. So, bad news. The homecoming was not a celebratory one. It was in the lead up, but everybody was hanging their heads at the end of the night. So we'll be here and we'll be cheering Jaime Munguia. And if this rematch does happen, you know it's going to attract even more attention because everybody's going to want to know if Jaime Munguia will be able to write this and get back into the win column, how he's going to get into the win column again. Chances are he will. But another defeat at the hand of Bruno Surace, and you could basically call it a career. Why? Because that's the way that this boxing world is, that they just immediately discard you. Now, losing to a Bruno Surace, just the mental aspect of it. If you lose to him again, Bruno Surace will start skyrocketing in his career respectively, but Jaime Munguia will be discarded. And mentally, who knows if you'll ever be the same. So we'll see, but right now it looks like they're fighting to get this rematch clause executed and make it happen in the next few months, in the next 3 months. Which should put it somewhere by then, we'll know between Nelson and Pacheco. It looks like Berlanga is going to fight Gabe Rosado. If you guys remember my interview with Gabe Rosado, you could check that out on YouTube as well, where I ask him about it, and he alludes that there's something in the works there for Berlanga and Rosado that he's been happy to oblige and to visit because it would be a big showdown between Philly and New York and fellow Puerto Rican fighters, Puerto Rican native fighters, heritage fighters. There's 2 positive notes that come out of this card. One, both of them in the super bantamweight division. One of them being Alan Picasso, who is the number 1 ranked super bantamweight in the world by many of the major organizations. And he's looking to get his shot against the king of the 122-pound division, Inoue. Alan Picasso, the 24-year-old sensation, Mexican sensation, again, successful, stops his opponent in the 3rd round, improves to 31-0 with 1 draw. That draw came in the 5th fight of his career. He's 31-0 now. He's tall, he's rangy, and he has a decent knockout ratio. 17 knockouts of his 31 victories. The other fighter that we got to keep an eye on is a fighter by the name of Sebastian Hernandez Reyes, who is ranked number 13 in the world in that very same division. 18-0 with 17 knockouts, and stopped Sergio Martin Sosa in the 7th round on the very same undercard on this night. Same division. He's on the coattails of, and he's on the tracks of Alan Picasso, climbing up the ranks. 18-0 with 17 knockouts. Looks very, very good, Sergio Hernandez. And Alan Picasso is just performing at an all-time high level right now. I would love to see him against a little bit better opposition. But as far as everybody that's been in front of him, he's been able to pick apart. So I would love to see Alan Picasso fight somebody of note. And talking about the 122-pound division, since we're already here, Naoya Inoue was supposed to have his big showdown against Sam Goodman. And that has been postponed. Sam Goodman suffers a cut in training and sparring, and that fight has been postponed to January, I believe. Sometime in mid or late January. So, no Inoue to close out 2024. But he's definitely going to open up the calendar year with this fight against Sam Goodman, and that's going to open up the doors to him whether he remains at 122 and faces Murrell. Murrell also went successful. Stops his opponent in a matchroom card out in Monte Carlo, I believe it was, for matchroom boxing. Murodjan Akhmadaliev, successful again, and calling out Naoya Inoue. Had a whole lengthy speech post-fight calling out Naoya Inoue. And that's the only face that Naoya really, that Inoue really needs to face at 122 before he decides to migrate north to the featherweight division. Murrow is the last standing man that everybody wants to see for us to say that Inoue cleaned out this division. And Alan Picasso is right there. So Alan Picasso, Sergio Hernandez, impressive. They're the ones that solidified the and rounded out the card for me. And of course, well, I'll leave you guys with that. Jaime Munguia, unfortunate that he comes out with a loss, the second defeat of his career against a relatively unknown fighter who didn't get much credit, but earned it. And we'll see what Zamfir and Top Rank decide to do. All signs pointing to executing and exercising their rematch clause with Bruno Surace, who's now 26-0 with 5 knockouts to his credit, I believe. So congrats to Bruno Surace, the Frenchman. And I leave you guys with that lengthy episode, but of course a lot to talk about because, man, this is one of the top names in the boxing in the boxing world today, at least for Mexican fighters, and definitely one of the top fighters that we've been talking about in the super middleweights, because this is one of the key pieces between Plant, Berlanga, Munguia, Pacheco, and who's going to be able to line up where. Berlanga loses to Canelo, Plant loses to Canelo, Munguia loses to Canelo, all trying to get a second, trying to run it back against the king of the super middleweights, and Pacheco's the only one that hasn't had his shot. Now with this happening, Munguia's going to have his hands full trying to climb back in. Now you got Mbili and Pacheco as the leads to land a big Canelo showdown in 2025 and punch their ticket to the big payday. But they got to be successful in their next outings. And of course, you got Osles Iglesias who's climbing up. And who's the other fighter? The Cuban fighter that just won Canelo's vacant title. He's the least likely to get a shot at Canelo. Remember, that was the mandatory. Canelo ended up not obliging that and went with Edgar Berlanga. William Skull. I'm forgetting him. Cuban fighter William Skull. I actually interviewed William Skull, and briefly, and you could check that out on YouTube, I ran into him a weekend ago or so, 2 weekends ago in the Oscar Valdez Navarrete. The night prior during the weigh-ins, I run into William Skull and Yordani Zugas, and you could check that out on YouTube. Brief encounter that I had with them, and they're telling me about how they're there to support Robeisy Ramirez on that card. So I'll leave you guys with that lengthy episode, but I appreciate every single second that you lend your ear to me. And thank you for the support, for the love. The channel continues to grow, and we'll continue pushing content your way. Take care of yourselves. Have a great night.